Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of Lies That Bind by Valerie Davisson, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Fit. Prologue, Tuesday, January 28th, 2020, The Collins Hotel, Depoe Bay, Oregon. Charlie flipped on the light, threw her towel on a chair, and kicked off her shoes. She had the place to herself. The cavernous room stretched before her. Warm, steamy air tinged with the familiar acrid smell of chlorine enveloped her. The white tiled floor was slick and wet. Walking with practiced care to the deep end, she stood at the edge of the pool for a minute, rolling her shoulders, shaking her arms out, loosening up. She really needed this. This week had been a real ball buster. First, the unending arguments with her grandmother. Why was she so against her and Wade getting married? Saturday night, when she told the indomitable Charlotte Collins in no uncertain terms that she and Wade were going ahead with the wedding, with or without her permission, the woman just about had a stroke. And the hotel, they'd never agree about that. Why couldn't her grandmother understand that she didn't want to run a hotel? Any hotel. The Collins may be grandmother Charlotte's whole life, but it wasn't hers. She thought she'd made that clear 4 years ago when she'd majored in anthropology, not hospitality. But Charlotte Collins wasn't one to give up easily. She knew her grandmother saw this trip as one last chance to change her mind, but she wasn't going to budge. She was so tired of talking about it that, like a coward, she'd been avoiding her since their big blow-up Sunday morning. Sunday, she'd waited until she heard grandmother's Mercedes crunch down the gravel driveway before calling Wade to let him know the coast was clear, at least for a few days. They were looking forward to the break. They'd worked it all out over breakfast. Grandmother would be away at her gardening conference up in Portland for most of the week. They were going to sit her down and talk about this rationally when she returned. Grandma would just have to accept that Charlie had a life of her own to lead, and it didn't include running the Collins. All she and Wade wanted to do was live their own lives. In just a few weeks, they were going to a small rural village in India, putting their education and skills to good use. Clean water for villagers was a lot more important than clean sheets for wealthy hotel guests. Wade was a genius. His water filtration system not only cleaned water, but had a desalinization component. They had a real chance at helping people, making the world a better place, saving lives. Why couldn't grandmother get that through her thick skull? It was sad the way things had turned out. Growing up, they had always been close. Grandmother Charlotte had practically raised her. Her mom shipped her out to Oregon the day after her 16th birthday after an unfortunate incident involving a fifth of scotch and a cute senior named Jared. There were other reasons her mother had sent her to live with her grandmother, but Charlie chose not to focus on those. Sometimes the memories were so distant and hazy she wasn't sure they actually happened. Besides, Charlie loved living with grandmother Charlotte here on the coast. She and grandmother even looked alike. The first time she'd seen the family portrait over the fireplace, she did a double take. People always said the woman in the picture looked like her, but that portrait had been taken back in the 40s. She was the baby in great grandmother's arms, not the Southern beauty standing in the back next to her husband, Charlie's great grandfather, Emerson. Same dark hair, though, blue eyes and ivory skin. Both strong willed, even that seemed to come out in the portrait. But that's where the resemblance ended. Grandmother Charlotte, a true Southern belle steeped in good manners and appearances, knew exactly how a lady should behave and expected her namesake to conform. Charlie, on the other hand, was a tomboy of the first degree, preferring fishing off the rocks or exploring the vast tracts of forest that stretched for miles behind the town. She built her first treehouse when she was 9 from scraps of lumber hauled from a construction project behind City Hall. Grandmother had not been pleased, but Charlie was still her favorite. Her older sister, Amanda, had lighter coloring and took after their mother. Adjusting her swim goggles, Charlie looked out over the smooth surface of the water, anticipating that delicious first plunge. She took a deep breath, then dove smoothly into the pool. She went deep, stretching her hands in front of her in perfect form, then scooped up just before she reached the bottom, allowing the momentum to propel her to the surface, pretending to be a dolphin or a mermaid like she did when she was little. She knew it was silly, but it never failed to make her smile. She loved the feel of water pushing against her face and along the sides of her body. Breaking the surface, she kicked off, reaching into her strokes, finding a relaxing rhythm. She'd do her 20 laps, shower off, then go back upstairs to the room, to Wade, to her future. Grandmother would come around. For the next 20 minutes, Charlie's muscles gradually released the tension she'd been holding all week. Flip turning gracefully, pushing off the end after each length. She was halfway across the pool after lap 18 when it hit. A fierce cramp like nothing she'd ever felt before, forcing her body to contract into a fetal position. It felt like someone stabbing her in the stomach. Before she could make it to the side to pull herself out, a wave of nausea gripped her and she cramped again. What was happening? She'd had a mild case of flu a few days ago, but this felt much worse than before. She'd never have gone swimming if she'd thought she was still sick. Unable to reach the edge, she tried to turn herself over and float, forced herself to relax until the cramp passed. But her arms and legs wouldn't work right. Within seconds, the severe cramping began again, followed by a hose of vomit. Her bowels emptied violently. She hadn't eaten much all day, so it was mostly liquid. They'll have to drain the pool. She realized how odd the thought was, even as she had it, as if that were her main concern. She had to get out. She struggled to get her body to obey her commands. She had to get to the side of the pool. It wasn't that far. She knew she couldn't swim in this condition and was too cramped up to even pull herself out. But maybe she could hand walk her way along the edge until she reached the shallow end. By using the handrail, she could crawl her way up the steps and lie there until she could move or someone came to find her. If she could just get herself out of the water. After what seemed like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, she felt the tips of her toes dragging along the bottom of the pool. Thank God. Facing the wrong direction, she couldn't see it, but at least she now knew she was at the shallow end. Just then, a whooshing sound announced someone's arrival as the door opened to the pool room. Relief flooded through her. Probably Wade coming to join her or see what was taking her so long. Sometimes when she was in the zone, she lost track of time. For some reason, she couldn't call out. All she could make was a gurgling sound, but surely he'd see her. Another spasm hit and she vomited again, unable to keep her body from folding forward, throwing her face into the water. She tried to hold her breath, but with every cell in her body desperately screaming for oxygen, she found herself inhaling deeply, searching for air, but only water filled her nostrils and rushed into her lungs. Where was Wade? Just before she passed out, she thought she heard splashing behind her. With every second she clung to consciousness, she expected Wade to pull her to safety, but the next human touch Charlie felt was a strong hand clamped onto the top of her head, pushing her completely under and holding her there. She couldn't put up much of a fight. Whatever signals her brain was sending weren't reaching the rest of her body. 17 seconds later, the lights went out, and the door to the pool area clicked shut, plunging the room into utter darkness. Only the distant thrum of the water pump and a slight lapping of the water against the sides of the pool could be heard. Soon, even that became perfectly still. The body at the bottom of the pool wasn't making any waves. Chapter 1, Sunday, February 7th, 1932, 12:03 a.m., Whale Cove, Central Oregon coast. The two men crouched low, hunched against the wind on the precipice of a sheer cliff. 60 feet below, gentle waves lapped on a narrow crescent of sandy beach, but beyond these sheltered waters, the angry ocean roared, throwing itself repeatedly against the black rocks guarding the narrow entrance to the cove. They're not coming. Don't worry, they'll be here. This is the night. You just can't see them. They're waiting for the right wave. Better a full boat late than splinters and dead men floating in on time, right? Frankie said, slapping Jacob on the back. Jacob said nothing, but simply stared harder into the inky dark, straining for the reassuring shape of a boat. This was his 5th trip, and if all went well, his last. In spite of, and maybe because of, the moonless night, the frothy wave caps glowed brilliantly white against the smooth licorice-colored waves as they pushed into the cove, skimming over a massive chunk of basalt lurking just below the surface, between the steep sides of the narrow opening, waiting to rip into the bottom of any boat that dared enter. Even if you knew it was there and it was broad daylight, it was almost impossible to get around. Frankie stomped his feet and headed back to the truck to get warm. They always make it, don't they? He said, slamming the door shut. You worry too much. Jacob looked back. Frankie's freckled face and bright red hair flashed into view as he struck a match and lit a cigarette. He was probably right. Frankie never worried about anything, and he seemed to be doing okay. Jacob turned his attention back to the sea, listening hard for the sounds of an engine. There was a reason no one but Rumrunners used this place, but because no one did, it was perfect. No houses, no lights, no nothing. Stretching only a third of a mile across at its widest point, Whale Cove wasn't on any mariner's map as a safe harbor on the Central Oregon coast. If any boat managed to make it in, the water was calm. Steep rocky cliffs kept the cove hidden from view from the sea. For the smugglers, it was perfect. Their vessel, the Sea Island, a sleek power boat out of Victoria, BC, was only 36 feet from stem to stern, but could carry over 3,000 gallons of whiskey and rum. Frankie kept telling him it was easy, and Jacob had to admit, so far, it had been. The Canadians worked out the system long before he and Frankie were enlisted to accept the product and help with the deliveries. The distribution routes established years before to accommodate the opium trade from China meant everything went smooth as silk. On each run, once the Sea Island was in safely, it was a simple matter of offloading the cases of liquor, hauling them up the cliff with rope and steel cables, then loading them onto the truck. Whale Cove was only a half-mile from Depoe Bay and 10 from Newport, but the roads were mostly deserted after dark. Under cover of night and after only a few hours of driving, pharmacies, back porches, and speakeasies from here to Florence restocked their hidden stashes with no one the wiser, except those patrolmen paid to look the other way. As long as he and Frankie didn't partake in any of the merchandise, the drive back was easy and perfectly safe. If stopped, they were just two men going to work after visiting family or looking for work or whatever. By tomorrow, Jacob would be driving home with enough money in his pocket to finally get out from under his father-in-law's thumb. Or at least he'd be closer to that goal. The man was nice enough, but he and Irene had their eye on getting their own place, a boarded-up trading post in Depoe Bay, right next to the harbor with plenty of room for little Aaron to play. With little fixing, make a great rooming house. Irene could cook and he could build or fix anything. It was a humble start, but they had big plans. There just wasn't enough room at her parents' house for their little family. In the new place, there would even be room for his mother. She was getting too old to do laundry anymore, and she could help Irene with Aaron. She'd like that. Just a few more runs.